Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Alice Connor Gorlin Memorial Lecture. Alice Connor Gorlin was an esteemed professor of economics at Oakland University from 1972 until her untimely death in 1987. She gained international recognition as a scholar of the Soviet economy. Her dedication to the role of human beings as citizens of the world led Dr. Gorlin's friends to establish this memorial lecture series to promote understanding of international issues. And today we have here with us in the audience Alice's husband, Robert Gorlin, and their daughter, Stella. Welcome. I'm delighted that you could be here today. I wish to thank the following for their assistance in putting this wonderful event together: the Office of Student Affairs for their financial support, the Economic Student Association for ushering today, Maggie Parker, who did a wonderful job organizing today's event, and the Gorlin Lecture Committee, Professors Coppin and Murphy. I'd now like to introduce Professor Addington Coppin, Chair of the Economics Department, who will introduce our distinguished speaker today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Silberman. Because Alice cared passionately about international issues, the Gorlin Lecture Series has accepted as its mission to promote the understanding of international issues and events. We are very pleased to have the privilege to carry on this work in Alice Gorlin's name. My role is to introduce our honored guest today. He is Dr. Matthew Slaughter. Dr. Slaughter earned his undergraduate degree from the University of Notre Dame and his PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. We seem to like MIT grads to give this lecture for some reason. Dr. Slaughter will address us on the topic, the economics and politics of globalization. It is our very great honor and privilege to have him at Oakland University. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm welcome to the 2007 Alice Connor Gorlin Memorial Lecturer, Dr. Matthew Slaughter.
Thank you, Addington, for that introduction, which was very kind. And I'd first like to acknowledge what an honor and privilege it is to be here to participate in the Gorlin Memorial Lecture. From what I've learned about Alice, she was indeed a scholar in every sense of the word, and being here as part of the history of this series is a real honor and a real treat. And so in her honor and spirit, I appreciate the invitation to come here today. And I appreciate that kind introduction. That I'm going to talk about the economics and politics of globalization. It's a topic that's been near and dear to my heart as an academic for a long time, from my undergraduate days and the graduate studies I did at MIT and the work that I've done since then. And I should say, in more recently, I've had the opportunity to kind of work on these issues. I've just recently returned to talk from being on leave when I served as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors. And so I thought I'd take a minute before we start to tell you a little bit about what CEA is, and kind of what my role was there before I kind of dive into the topic at hand. So as of March 1, I took leave of my service at CEA. CEA is an entity that resides in the Executive Office of the President. So CEA was established, actually, if you look at the law, the Employment Act of 1946 that created CEA, and read the enabling language and a little bit about its history, it's an interesting institution. CEA was created at the end of World War II, at a time when a lot of business leaders and policymakers in the United States were very concerned that with the coming drawdown in military spending with the end of World War II, that the United States and other countries in the world might lapse back into the Great Depression. Because when you look at a lot of the basic macroeconomic indicators, the United States and a lot of other industrial powers at that time really didn't move out of the Great Depression until the advance of government spending that was related to the buildup of materiel needed for the war. So CEA was created at a time when there was a lot of uncertainty about the world economy, about the macroeconomy, and the idea of CEA has always been to have an institution inside the executive branch, and there's a sibling agency that was created out of the Employment Act of 1946 called the Joint Economic Committee, and the JEC serves the Congress. And the idea of both JEC and the CEA is to have an entity that's there to provide objective, nonpartisan economic advice to the policymaking process. Since that time, CEA, it's grown a little bit. We're not all that big in the executive branch. CEA is about 40 people altogether. So if you know a bit about the federal government structure, our sibling agencies that CEA works with, Commerce Department, State Department, Treasury Department, they're much, much bigger agencies with thousands of people. And the structure of CEA for quite some time now has been, there's about 40 of us all together. There are 3 members of the CEA. The 3 members are presidential appointees. They're Senate-confirmed positions. Of the 3 members, one is designated to be the chairman. It was Ben Bernanke, who was chairman of CEA, who asked me to come on board, and I was with Ben for a little while. Ben moved on to become chairman of the Federal Reserve to replace Alan Greenspan, who himself had been at CEA in the 1970s in the Ford administration. And so CEA has this history where in recent times, the members are typically drawn from academics, and our job is to be there to provide again, this sort of objective, geek, nonpartisan economics advice and analysis to the relevant decision makers. The E and the A are taken quite literally, so our job is to weigh in on matters of economics, and our job is to offer advice. CEA does not make policy decisions. CEA does not implement policy, but our job is to be involved in the policy-making decisions from the president on down to play a role in trying to provide analysis and advice. And as I told some people earlier, one of my graduate school advisors was actually not at MIT, but he was up the road at Harvard, a gentleman named Robert Lawrence. And Robert had been the international member the last couple of years of the Clinton administration. And he gave me a bit of advice going in, which was quite apt, and maybe we'll get into that a little bit. He said, go there, it's great public service to do, but keep in mind you will spend a lot of your time pulling weeds. You won't spend much of your time planting seeds. Meaning our job at CEA is there's a lot of people and good public servants and elected officials who are there trying to formulate economic policy in our country, many of whom are not economists by training or by practice, and so our job is to try to be there to help move people away perhaps from some ideas that maybe aren't on base in terms of economics and get them to at least be aware of the economic implications of particular policy decisions. And when I was at CEA, my portfolio of the other 2 members as the chairman, one of the other 2 members traditionally has the international economics portfolio, and that was my area. So the issues that I dealt with were issues of international trade and investment, issues of energy was in my portfolio, immigration, issues of global imbalances, foreign direct investment, the Doha development round, and the WTO. Those are the kinds of things that were part of my portfolio. CEA, it's a neat institution, it has a neat history. We're kind of there to do the good economics as is in the public domain. I'm a registered independent, so I'm not, the CEA members aren't there for the politics. We're kind of there to try to provide a bit of economics analysis to the ongoing policy discussions. And so with that as a little bit of background, the issues that I'm going to talk about today are issues that were very front and center in the 18 months that I was at CEA. And they're issues that I've worked on previously as an academic and will continue to work on as an academic going forward. And the other thing I should say is I'm very happy to have this be a conversation rather than just me talking, so I'm happy to take questions from anyone along the way. With that as an opening, why don't I move ahead? What I want to do actually, what people would sometimes say to me when they'd ask, well, what's it like at CEA and how does it differ from being an academic? One of the ways I try to characterize it was to say, well, my job at CEA is I get paid to worry. Our job is to worry about what's happening in the US economy, worry what's happening in the global economy, and try to make the relevant policymakers aware of things that they should worry about also. So I thought we'd spend a little bit of time in today talking about 3 things that I did spend a lot of time worrying about and that I still worry about today. So I don't want this to be too dour, but hopefully it'll be a good conversation. But there's 3 things that I want to talk about. I want to talk about a particular US industry. I want to talk about paychecks and Lou Dobbs, and I want to talk about being a baby buster. Okay? And they're all related, I think, but I'll go through them in that order. So I want to show you a couple of pictures of a U.S. industry. It's actually, I want to show you kind of a tale of 2 generations of a U.S. industry. I'm not going to tell you which one it is, but I want us to think about the pictures that I have here first, and then I'm going to tell you which one it is. Okay? So here's a picture of a generation of an American industry on the horizontal axis here, I'm kind of a data geek, so I'm going to show you some numbers today in part. Every year from 1960 to the early 1980s, and I've got 3 data items each year for this particular industry. If you can see, there's a line here in pink. That's our exports going out of the United States to the rest of the world in this particular industry. On the vertical axis here, instead of having dollars, I've scaled it by percent of output in that industry. Okay, so instead of having dollar value on the vertical axis, we've got percent of output. So again, pink shows us exports going out of the US to the rest of the world for this particular industry. The dark blue or purple line here that I'm tracing out shows us imports coming into the United States from the rest of the world in this particular industry. And then that third line there, the yellow one, is just the difference between the exports and imports. So that's our trade balance with the rest of the world. So this is an industry over the 1960s and 70s in which we imported some stuff from the rest of the world, but we exported a bigger and rising amount to the rest of the world, so that on balance we ran a positive and growing trade surplus with the rest of the world in this industry. That's that yellow line there. And I think, if you think about yourself, you think about kind of the broad business policy discussions about globalization and all its different forms, I think a lot of people look at this picture and they find it comforting. They kind of think this is what globalization should be all about. This is kind of a good picture, right? So that's a generation. Now let me show you the next generation. And as you can see, things changed a little bit. The pink line, again, is exports going out of the US to the rest of the world. So our exports to the rest of the world in this industry continued to grow. But I think what your eye is drawn to is the explosion of imports coming into the United States from the rest of the world in this particular industry. So the balance between the two, exports and imports, started to change quite dramatically. The trade surplus that we were running with the rest of the world shrank throughout the 1980s, had disappeared by the late 1980s, after which we began to run ever-growing trade deficits with the rest of the world. By the year 2000, the last year that I have up here for data, our trade deficit in this industry with the rest of the world was 100% of GDP. The total aggregate US trade deficit as a share of output this last year was about 6.5% of GDP. This is 100% of GDP. In dollar values, by 2000, our trade deficit with the rest of the world in this industry was approaching $50 billion. Last year, it clocked in at about $55 billion. Right? Now, the nice thing is being done at CEA, I'm no longer bound by my ethics agreement. So if I wanted to, I could now actually take wagers from everybody. And we could make a market here, and I could ask you to write on pieces of papers, and I'd make odds. And I'm happy to take any guesses out loud if people have any idea what industry they think this might be. Electronics? Okay, electronics. Autos, right? I know that I'm in Michigan today, right? So, automobiles, transportation products. I heard steel. I heard clothing. I hear textiles, apparel, footwear a lot of times with this industry. Oil. Okay. It's manufacturing, so take oil off the board as a kind of a commodity. Aircraft. And I think a lot, so all wonderful guesses, I'll get there, don't worry. But I think a lot of people, when they look at this picture, and I can tell you, especially having used this a lot in my role at CEA, a lot of people look at this second generation and they don't feel as good. And they start to worry. And they say, this is the bad dimension of globalization. And this is unfair foreigners with unfair trade practices. And they got their trade barriers and they're keeping out American products. And this is the problem of globalization. And we need to fix it somehow. Right? So then the $64,000 question is, what industry is it? And it's somewhat, at least, is in the bonus round. It's actually computers and office products. So if you're a data geek like me, it's the old SSC industry 357. Right? Now, think about what we know about the anecdotes of this particular industry. What actually went on in terms of the industrial organization of computers and office products? Well, around the time that personal computers were invented in the early 1980s, we had a lot of manufacturing production of the hardware of all that stuff inside the United States. We actually had a lot of production of the early personal computers, like the Apple IIe and the early IBM ones that ran on DOS and all that stuff. Those were made not just in the United States, they were made in California. There were production facilities in Silicon Valley, the actual manufacturing of this stuff. But then what started to happen was a lot of the companies involved realized that to raise profitability and reduce costs and lower their prices, they could change the production process by starting to break apart the constituent stages and move the production literally all over the globe. So what started to happen as we moved through the 80s and into the 90s was companies in IT hardware began to establish and expand cross-border production networks. mediated by linkages of multinational firms in a lot of the time, and flows of goods and services across borders, a lot of cross-border trade of components and intermediates and final goods. So you may know the anecdotes. For example, the hard disk drive in particular migrated from a lot of production in the United States. Singapore became a world leader in hard disk production. And then the anecdote that I come back to for today, and it's a wide range of IT products that are like this, is during my time at CEA, I commuted every week back and forth from New Hampshire to Washington. And my wife and I have two boys, and they stayed in Hanover. They got me as a present for this a little iPod Nano for passing time in the airports. And if you look at the back of your iPod Nano, if you have one or can find one, on the back of every iPod Nano is stamped the phrase, designed by Apple in California, assembled in China. And that's a good anecdote of what IT hardware is for a lot of products today, which is the set of activities we do in the United States in IT hardware is now quite different from what it was a generation ago or 2 generations ago. We do a lot of the early stage R&D, we do a lot of the design, we do a lot of the marketing and the advertising and the early stage protocol production perhaps, but a lot of the main manufacturing is now scattered all over the world, mediated across borders through these links of international trade and investment, right? A follow-up question that's not an idle one, what's the only industry in the world since the World Trade Organization was created in 1995 as a successor to the GATT that's actually had a comprehensive free trade agreement? There's one industry in the world since the WTO was founded that's had a comprehensive free trade agreement to eliminate all tariffs among all signatory countries. It wasn't autos, it wasn't steel, it wasn't textiles, apparel, and footwear. It was information technology. The Information Technology Agreement was signed in late 1996 by dozens of countries, and it covered about 250 product categories, capital goods, intermediate inputs, final goods, in IT hardware. And 4 equal tariff cuts were implemented by all signatory countries from 1997 through 2001. So this period through here, where we see this big surge in imports in particular. When economists like me talk about the benefits of free trade and investment, it's this pressure on product prices and the ability to refine what countries do according to comparative advantage that our models talk about. IT hardware seems to have been exhibit A of that, right? So another question I want to ask then is who's gained and who's lost from this particular evolution of the dynamics of the kind of industrial organization of this industry? Think about you and I as consumers. Have we benefited from this? I think we have. I see a lot of people nodding their heads. Think about the recent birthday or holiday shopping you've done over the recent years when you go to Best Buy and stores like that. And think about all of the IT hardware products like the computer I'm running this off of and digital cameras and these fancy TVs we have now. And I want you to, I think a lot of us probably have this in our minds, but I want to highlight it. Think about how you go to Best Buy and you look at a particular digital camera and you're like, wow, I was here 6 weeks ago. Why hasn't the price fallen by 1/3? You know, that kind of happened the last time I'd come here, and you know, why hasn't it happened again? IT hardware, you and I have seen the benefits of globalization of production in this industry in the astonishing quality-adjusted price declines in IT hardware. And I'll gently point out, IT hardware is wildly different from almost any other product, be it a good or a service that our economy produces in terms of the rate of quality-adjusted price declines it's been able to deliver. It's had a heck of a lot to do with globalization. I gently suggest we can't rerun history. We can't do experiments in economics where we can kind of go back to 1980 and shut down US borders. So we can't do controlled experiments like a lot of other fields. But there's a preponderance of evidence that leads me to make this assertion that if we go back to 1980 and rerun world history but shut down US borders in IT hardware and don't allow any international trade and investment, and in particular don't allow any immigration either, we simply wouldn't have had the IT revolution and the price declines and all the creation of products that we've seen in the past generation. And I'll emphasize immigration really matters for this picture as well. A really neat study was done looking at, over the 1990s, startup companies in Silicon Valley, in IT, and also in biotechnology. And what this particular study did was went and looked at the names of all the corporate officers in these newly found companies and looked at their nationality. And over the period of the 1990s, this survey found that fully 25%, 1 in 4 of all the corporate officers in these new IT and biotech startups were immigrants from either India or China. So immigration has been another dimension of globalization that's been central to this industry. So you and I benefited as consumers What about the country overall? Has the country overall benefited from this? I'll come back to that in a minute. I think the answer is yes. But has everybody benefited? Did every production worker in the United States in IT hardware benefit from this evolution? Maybe, maybe not. Right? I'll come back to that. And then another question you could ask is, where's your favorite firm on this timeline? Based on these kinds of measures of looking at the flow of trade across borders, the extent of FDI across borders, most companies and most industries in the United States today look like IT hardware in the late 1970s. They're much less globally integrated than IT hardware is. And if you follow any of the public policy discussion about globalization in recent times, there's a lot of concern, to put it mildly, about what globalization means. And I think it's partly because people are realizing so much of the US economy really hasn't been directly exposed to the forces of international competition like IT hardware has. There was a wonderful front page story in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, I think it was actually, on this. Alan Blinder at Princeton University has done some interesting work trying to guesstimate how much of the jobs that we have in the United States today might be directly exposed to this type of pressures of international competition. Okay? So this is a particular US industry. I'll come back to this question of, has the overall US economy benefited from the global engagement in IT hardware? And I'll submit the answer is absolutely. Here's an important fact. Economists, when you talk about how a given country is doing, in a big picture sense of what are the living standards, how are people doing in terms of their quality of life, how are their kids going to do, the grandkids going to do, those kind of big picture questions. The single best measure, there's many you could probably look at, but almost every economist will tell you the one best summary statistic for how a country is doing is its productivity performance. That is, what's the output per worker on average throughout the entire country, and how fast or slow is that productivity growing? And the single most important fact for you to have in your heads, in case you don't, about how the US economy has done in the past decade, has been the story of productivity acceleration. Productivity growth in the US has accelerated since 1995. And what that means on the income side is that average real earnings and average living standards, the rate of growth of those things has been accelerating also. I've italicized and emphasized the adjective average, because I'm going to come back to that. I'm talking about on average right now. I'm going to talk about distribution in a minute. But here's the numbers. From 1973 to 1995, non-farm labor productivity in the United States, which is kind of the best measure that a lot of economists like to look at, that grew at a rate of 1.35% per year. In the decade since, starting in 96, productivity growth has been double that. It's been about 2.7% per year. That might not sound like a lot, but given the magic of compound interest, the implication for how fast living standards rise is astonishing. At that old rate of 1.35% per year, it was taking 52 years for average living standards in the United States to double. So when people sit at night and think about, gosh, how my kids are going to be doing when they grow up and grandkids, the answer was it's going to take a long time for their material living standards to double. If we can continue the current productivity growth rate of 2.7% per year, we'll have living standards on average doubling in half that time, in just 26 years. That's a whole generation faster. And so for a lot of the big picture economic policy questions that face our country today, productivity growth is central. So then the question is, what accounts for the productivity growth acceleration that we've enjoyed, right? If you follow monetary policy in the United States, for example, you know that Alan Greenspan, one of the things he will go down in history as being most famous for, was recognizing this productivity acceleration in the United States and its implications for how we should conduct monetary policy. A lot of people like Alan Greenspan and academic economists were interested in trying to understand, was this productivity acceleration equally shared across all businesses and all industries in the US, or was it concentrated in particular industries? And if you got the right data and you crunch the numbers the right way, you can answer that question. And the answer that I have up here was, no, it wasn't every industry doing its equal share. IT hardware was central to the productivity acceleration. And again, you and I see this as consumers, these quality-adjusted price declines that have been so striking in IT hardware for many years now. That's the price manifestation of this really fast productivity growth in IT hardware. And also, another reason IT hardware has been so important was all the other good profit-maximizing companies in the economy responded to the accelerated price declines of IT hardware by buying more IT capital goods. So both directly, the IT firms themselves, and indirectly by accelerating the purchases of capital goods of IT hardware, both those things tend to make workers more productive on average throughout our economy. So IT hardware has been really, really important. And I put up here this phrase in italics. The message here that's really important is these IT firms that have been central for the productivity acceleration in the United States, they're among the most globally engaged companies that we have. And it conveys this really important policy message, which is that global engagement is really, really important for productivity growth. Lots of studies have been done by economists looking at particular firms and industries and countries, showing that through lots of different channels of causation, international trade and investment are really important spurs to productivity growth. Close to home, an example that has been, the big three automakers have faced the pressures of international competition of companies like Toyota and Honda for many, many years now through trade and investment. And the data show pretty clearly that part of the productivity gains and performance improvements by the big three has been because of this international competition. Not quite sure what we do there. So why am I worried? So all that sounds kind of neat, right? I mean, I told you the globalization of IT hardware has been fantastic, and that IT has been central for productivity growth in the United States. So at this point, you might say, I thought you were going to tell us what you're worried about. So what are you worried about, right? What I'm worried about. I'm sorry? Yeah, because this technology doesn't work, exactly. When economists talk about skill-biased technological change, you just saw which side of that I'm on, right? That's the problem. I'm the house trash and recycling guy. So why am I worried? The reason I'm worried is because in the United States today, I will assert there is a material drift in policy opinions and actual policy away from more open borders. Meaning the following. There's rising protectionist slow international trade. The Doha development round of the WTO has basically collapsed at this point through no fault of the hard work of our colleagues my former colleagues at the U.S. Trade Representative's Office and the efforts of our governments around the world. But the Doha development round is close to being completely dead. There are many bills that have been introduced both in the U.S. House and Senate, Graham's Schumer bill being a prominent example, that want to restrict the flow of imports coming into the United States, in particular from China. Senators Graham and Schumer have proposed that we should levy a 27.5% tariff or tax on every single product that we import into the United States from China. And Trade Promotion Authority, which is a power sharing arrangement between the executive and legislative branches in our country that govern how we negotiate and implement trade treaties with the rest of the world. Trade Promotion Authority is due to expire at the end of June of this calendar year. And to put it mildly, the prospects for renewal of that is grim. And what that implies is that the rest of the world then has much less of an incentive to negotiate with the United States, because without TPA, any other country in the world is negotiating not just with the executive branch, but then with 535 elected people in Congress as well, that can reopen the particular agreements in any trade treaty that gets put up to Capitol Hill. So there's rising protectionist slow international trade. There's rising protectionist slow inward foreign direct investment as well. So examples here. There was a Chinese company that wanted to purchase Unical, which is a US-based energy company, in 2004 and into 2005. They withdrew their bid based on a large amount of hue and cry that arose in Washington, D.C., that we shouldn't allow Chinese companies to buy particular assets in the United States. DP World, this was a company based in Dubai that purchased the operations rights to service 6 US ports in the United States. And about a year ago now, that generated a large political controversy in the United States. People said we can't possibly allow companies from the Middle East to buy particular assets of our companies. And DP World eventually unwound that transaction. And in both the House and Senate last calendar year, bills were voted on and passed, although it never made it out of conference committee to reconcile them to become law, to substantially reform what is called CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. CFIUS is an interagency governmental panel. There's 12 government agencies that sit on it. CEA is one of them, so when I was at CEA, I was our CFIUS person. And our job is to look at any potential national security implications of inward M&A transactions. Both in practice and in language, the United States is becoming much more restrictive to inward foreign direct investment. So I worry because despite the really important role that global engagement has played historically for fostering productivity growth in the United States, and therefore growth in average living standards, there's what I would actually call an alarmingly high growth of protectionist sentiments in the United States. And that's a problem, I think, from the standpoint of what's going to happen to productivity growth. And I'll point out, as a matter of data, that since 2002, aggregate productivity growth in the United States has been decelerating for 4 years running. Productivity growth was 4.1% in 2002. By the end of 2006, productivity growth in 2006 at an annualized rate was just 1.6%. We don't yet know why, but I will point out the juxtaposition of a lack of ongoing liberalization of trade and investment, and on some measures a movement away from more open borders of trade and investment in recent years, coinciding with the deceleration of productivity growth in the United States. So I worry about the policy drift in the United States. I also worry when I think about the policy changes around the world. I have up here a couple of illustrative quotes, one from Germany, one from China. Many other countries, it's not just the United States, but many other countries, other advanced countries, even many middle and low income countries, in statement and in practice are moving away from more open borders. So in Germany, for example, a prominent government official in 2005 articulated the view that inward foreign investment in finance, in particular in private equity, one of these things that one hears about, was especially damaging, and that these foreign firms come in, they have no face, fall upon companies like locusts, very provocative language in Germany given its history, devour them and move on. And in China, for example, which has been a major beneficiary of inward foreign direct investment in its astonishing growth that they've enjoyed in the past generation. In the past year or two, both in language and in practice now, the government is becoming much more restrictive on allowing inward foreign direct investment to proceed. So I worry about the policy stance of the United States, and I worry around the world as well. And the other reason that I worry about this protectionist drift that is so different from, again, the IT history is when we think about trade, not just for particular industries, but in the aggregate, when we think about the overall trade deficit and current account deficit that the United States runs. Here's a picture I think some of you might be familiar with. This is the trade deficit, or approximately the current account deficit, a couple other accounting figures in here in the current account deficit, for the whole country of the United States, not just for IT hardware, but for all industries together. Again, I don't have the dollar value here on the vertical axis, it's percent, but the picture here that a lot of us know is that the US has been running a large and growing current account deficit with the rest of the world. Last year it came in at about 6.4% of GDP in 2006. That was $857 billion to you and me. That means that we bought from the rest of the world $857 billion more in goods and services than we sold to them. They didn't give it all that difference to us for free. Like families, we made up for the difference by selling assets to the rest of the world last year. So on net, we had to sell $857 billion in assets to the rest of the world to pay for this imbalance. And if you know kind of the national statistics, what the economics that underlies this is the fact that as a country overall, our total national savings is far less than the investment that our companies undertake. And so to pay for that capital investment, we have to tap into not just domestic savings, but savings from the rest of the world. That's their purchase of our assets on net. A lot of people talk about this current account deficit in the United States, and they worry about it. And they ask about how is this current account deficit, or more generally what oftentimes gets called, how will these global imbalances, how are they going to adjust? I spent a lot of time on this when I was at CEA, and there's a lot of concern in the business and policy world about whether the extent of these global imbalances, if they moderate and revert to not being as large, if that's going to happen gradually and without big economic costs, or is it going to happen suddenly with big costs? Now, I don't have a particular crystal ball on this, so we can all talk about what the future might look like. The hope among a lot of people is that there'll be a kind of a soft landing of global imbalances, which means we're going to have a little bit less capital investment maybe and a bit more national savings to close this savings investment imbalance that drives the current account deficit. What might that look like? Well, we're already seeing part of it with the slowdown in residential housing construction, because housing is part of national investment. Maybe more savings in the United States. Maybe households might save more. Maybe the government might save more. And whether that's going to happen, I'd be happy if we can talk about the likelihood of that. But the concern of people is that we have a hard landing. What that would mean is if tomorrow lots of the international investors, governments, central banks, private actors, might decide they really don't want to buy as many US assets at the current prices. Well, then we'll have to have some price adjustments to induce the rest of the world to buy our assets. The prices will have to go down. And that might mean big adjustments in particular asset markets. It might mean a major depreciation of the US dollar. It might mean a major rise in US interest rates. And those things might have impacts on the real economy in terms of capital investment, spending by households, and therefore overall economic activity. That's the concern about this hard landing scenario. When I was at CEA, every time I met officials from a foreign central bank or a foreign finance ministry or foreign investors that run portfolios and hedge funds and this kind of thing. You have to do a lot of that. There's kind of this diplomatic dimension to the international member. Every person I'd meet in that context during my 18 months at CEA, I'd ask them all the same one question. I'd say, tell me a story that you think is going to trigger this high cost, hard adjustment scenario for global imbalances. And I'd get 1,001 stories, but almost all of them started with the same chapter. And the opening chapter almost always was the same thing, where people would say, well, if the US becomes sufficiently protectionist. And then they'd say different things, and they said, well, on the trade front, if Doha breaks down, or on the foreign investment front, if we really reform our CFIUS process, then I'm worried that the rest of the world will really shift their demand away from US assets and won't be willing to finance the current account deficit in the US. How likely is that? I don't know, but I'll point out again, one of the reasons to care about this protectionist drift in the United States is not just kind of the microeconomic issue of productivity growth, but there's this macroeconomic issue of what's going to happen with the extent of global imbalances that we have in the world today in a macro sense. Okay? That was just my first worry, right? Is a particular US industry. And now I want to talk about paychecks. I want to put up some data here in a minute, but the important fact that all of us need to have in our heads is the following. Growth in earnings has lagged productivity growth and has aggravated income inequality in the United States for quite some time. That's not a political statement, that's an empirical statement, that's data. Income inequality in the United States started rising, depending on what measure you look at, in the mid to late 1970s. And from the mid to late 1970s until about the mid to late 1990s, the main kind of cleavage that economists saw in terms of whose earnings were going up and whose earnings were staying constant or falling in real terms, that is inflation-adjusted terms, was kind of college graduates and above and everybody below. What's happened in the past 5 or 10 years is very different. Income inequality is now rising, but the skewness of income inequality has increased dramatically in recent years, such that the slice of who's in the labor force that's enjoying average increases in their real earnings has become much, much, much more narrow. Okay? If you're interested, the Wall Street Journal this week has been running a number of pieces actually on globalization and income inequality. There's some interesting data items here. One of the ways that people get at the data is by looking at tax returns. There are a couple of economists who've looked at this. There's a big article in today's New York Times business page that talks about what we see in the tax data in recent years. I'm going to show you one way to look at this, which is looking at growth in inflation-adjusted money earnings by people by educational group. So who's more skilled and less skilled? Well, there's different ways to measure that, none of which is perfect, but one of the ways that economists typically do that is by looking at educational attainment. That's a pretty good, not perfect, pretty good proxy for people's labor market skills. It's not perfect, right? Bill Gates is a college dropout, and Bill Gates has done okay. So the data I'm going to show you here are taking data once a year. When every year our government in August, the Census Bureau puts out a report on poverty rates in the United States. And the underlying data that support the numbers on number of people in poverty in the United States, number of people without health coverage. They also put out a lot of statistics that come from the underlying data surveys, and they do different tabulations on these surveys. So the nice thing about the tabulations that our Census Bureau puts out every August is they put out pretty detailed statistics on average total money earnings in a given year for everybody by educational group, from high school dropouts all the way to the highest advanced degrees. And I'm going to show you those numbers in a minute. But what I'm going to show you here is from 2000 through 2005. The most recent year we have data on is 2005. And I go back from 2000 to 2005 because that's kind of, I want to try to abstract from the business cycle a little bit. So it's kind of peak to roughly peak. Total money earnings, it's not all compensation that people might earn. So I'm missing non-money compensation. Two big categories there are employer-provided health insurance. The other one I'm missing is stock options and equity grants. If we're thinking about inequality, I think if anything, we're probably understating inequality. But keep in mind as I show you these figures that we're missing some of the compensation for people. Okay? And real means I've adjusted for inflation. So you take the money earnings every year, in some sense people's total W-2 that year, and I'm going to adjust for inflation so we abstract from increases in general prices. Okay? And I'm going to show it by educational group. I'm going to show you what share of payroll jobs these folks counted for in the year 2005, and I'm going to show you their earnings growth over those 5 years. And it's cumulative. It's not annualized. It's cumulative. Start with high school dropouts. In 2005, 9.9% of people who had payroll jobs in the US Again, payroll jobs, about 135 million workers in 2005. 9.9% of them were high school dropouts. Over that period of 2000 through 2005, mean earnings for that group was negative 4.6%. So all high school dropouts together over that period, average total money earnings fell by 4.6%. That's not saying that happened to every person. Some might have done really well, some might have done really poorly. This is just on average. And economists oftentimes want to look at these averages in different parts of the overall economy because they're indicative of kind of where productivity gains are accruing. And again, we've had this productivity acceleration in the United States the past 10 years. One possible outcome on the income side might be those productivity gains are enjoyed equally for everybody throughout the income distribution. Maybe, but I think I'm showing you right now already that it hasn't quite been happening. That's high school dropouts. Here's high school graduates, 29.8% of payroll jobs, so about 3 in 10 workers are high school grads. Their earnings fell a little bit over that period, 0.2% in real terms. Move up the educational ladder and we get people with some college. This is a mix of both people without an advanced degree, without an intermediate degree, and those who have like a 2-year associate degree lumped together. About 28% of payroll jobs, their earnings fell by 2.5%. Notice if you're adding up in the employment share column, I've just crossed through the median worker in the American labor force. Yes, we in America have one of the most educated labor forces in the world. It's one of our competitive strengths. But keep in mind that the median worker today has a high school degree and about 1 year of post-high school education. Right? 1945, it was the much bigger share of people were in this kind of group. It's been falling, but notice the median worker, again, if we ran a little wager here, I probably would have made a little money on that here because a lot of people say, oh, the average person in the labor force is a college graduate. We are far from that, right? And the last thing I'll say before I keep going, if I'd showed you these data from like 79 through 95, kind of late 70s to mid 90s, once I kept going, we'd see pluses, right? Because again, the cleavage of income inequality was kind of college graduates and above, and then everybody in below. So let me show you college graduates, just people who have 4 years degrees, not any kind of advanced degree. College graduates, 21% of payroll jobs, earnings falling by 3.1% over that period. Right? I'm not saying drop out, those of you who are here, but okay. Let's keep going. Let me next show you non-professional master's degrees. So master's in social work, master's in public policy. 8% of payroll jobs, mean earnings fell by 1.8%. If you're keeping score at home, I've just showed you 96.6% of payroll jobs in the United States in 2005. None of those educational cohorts had increases in their mean real earnings over that period. Who's left? The PhDs, okay, an increase of 2.9%. And then the other little slice that's left, the 1.9% of payroll jobs, is the professional degrees, the doctors and the lawyers and the MBAs. And their mean earnings growth was 10.6%. Income growth in the United States has become astonishingly skewed in the past 5 to 10 years. And the other factor of production, to talk about the economics, where have the productivity gains gone on the income side in recent years? It's the very, very high-end workers, and who else? What's the other big factor of production? It's capital. It's to companies. Corporate profitability, if you look at the data on corporate profitability, growth in profitability has been fantastic in recent years. I'm not saying this is good or bad or ugly, but I'm telling you it's data. And I'm telling you it's very different data from the kinds of distribution of earnings growth that we've seen in the United States in decades at least, right? And again, different data sets will show you this quite through different slices. The data that have come out on looking at tax files, looking at people's tax returns, shows a very similar picture. The thing in the New York Times today, the factor that comes out that's quite striking is in 2005, take the top three, I think it was 300,000 tax filers, line everybody up in terms of lowest earnings to highest, take the 300,000 highest income earners over that period, add up all of their adjusted gross income on their tax returns. That amount was equal, in terms of their total earnings, to the amount of earnings that you get when to equal that, starting from the bottom, you have to go through 150 million people. I'm not saying that's good or bad, but I'm saying this is data, which is income inequality in the United States has grown dramatically in recent years at the very, very high end. Okay? Now, what does that have to do with paychecks and kind of the political economy of globalization? When I think about the political economy of globalization in recent years, if you ask me, give me if the old saw, a picture's worth 1,000 words, I'll give you 2 pictures. Here's one. Here's Lou Dobbs, and some of you may be aware of who Lou Dobbs is. He has a record-breaking show on CNN called Lou Dobbs Tonight, and he's been running a theme on his show for many years now called Exporting America. And the subtitle of his book here is Why Corporate Greed is Shipping American Jobs Overseas. And his more recent book, here's the other picture, 2,000 words, War on the Middle Class, How the Government, Big Business, and Special Interest Groups are Waging War on the American Dream and How to Fight Back. Now, what I've found over the years in my academic and policy circles is a lot of people, when you mention Lou Dobbs, they'll roll their eyes and they say, oh my God, the guy's a crank. He's just out to get ratings. It's just a publicity ploy. An alternative interpretation is Lou Dobbs actually taps in to the opinions of a lot of people in America. I'd love to be able to tell you as I stand here that the former interpretation is correct and we can just kind of laugh and say Lou Dobbs is just out to get good ratings and all of that. But I've spent a bit of time over the years looking at the public opinion evidence about what people think about globalization. And the message of that is Lou Dobbs actually isn't that far off base. So what do people think about globalization? When you think about the policy outcomes I mentioned, the drift away from freer trade and investment in our country, again, put immigration in there as well, right? We've not exactly been able to come to some national consensus on immigration reform in this country in the past year or two. And I'm not claiming in thinking about policy decisions about trade and investment and immigration that economics is the only consideration or should be the predominant consideration. Clearly not. But when you look at kind of how America, or any other country for that matter, forms these policy opinion and policies, what people think, kind of voter preferences, is a really important ingredient for getting a set of policy outcomes. So over the years, I spent a bit of time looking at public opinion evidence, looking at what American voter preferences are about things like globalization. And thanks to the internet, you can find a lot of interesting data that are out there to try to understand what people think about globalization. And I have a dear friend who's an old college roommate who's now a political scientist. We spent some time a few years ago doing a little book where we went back and looked at data all the way back to the 1920s to try to understand what has been the evolution of American thinking about globalization. And here are a few key messages that are important to have in your head. The typical American doesn't like globalization. They oppose freer trade, they oppose more immigration, they oppose and are worried about foreign direct investment. Now, if you know something about public opinion evidence, polling and how you frame questions and things, that all really matters. And what exactly are the answers and the crosstabs you get, very critically sensitive to how you frame questions and who says what and how you phrase it in what order. All that's important, yeah. But a consistent plurality to majority of Americans say they don't want freer trade, they definitely don't want more immigrants coming in, and they're definitely worried about foreign direct investment. Okay? And importantly, a lot of people then, when they're presented with that evidence, say, well, the problem is everyone needs to come to Oakland University and to Dartmouth and Tuck and American schools and learn about all the benefits of globalization. Don't Americans understand that when they go to Walmart every Saturday, how much globalization benefits them, or when they go to Best Buy, like we talked about earlier, because they've got lower prices and greater choices, and that globalization is a great thing? Not quite. Yes, Americans get it. 80–90% of Americans, when you look at the public opinion questions, will acknowledge all the benefits of globalization that the business community, policy people, and academics talk about. It's not that people don't understand the benefits, but people express deep and wide concerns about the labor market pressures of globalization. Right? Perceived pressures on job separations, and importantly, perceived pressures on wages. People are pretty sophisticated, and when I think about it as an economist, they care about their real earnings. That is, their inflation-adjusted earnings. Yes, they are sophisticated enough to understand, yeah, I benefit as a consumer in terms of enjoying lower prices when I go to Walmart, but I also care what's happening in my W-2 and my employment opportunities and what kind of job I have. Yeah?
The statistics you talked about before were specifically said that payroll derived income. Do you have any contrasting or corresponding statistics for people like the entrepreneurs that are not typically not compensated by payroll, or the vast income is they're compensated by their own dividends of their own companies that they own and started or what have you? Statistics.
Yep. That was a great question. Let me just repeat it. It was the earlier data I showed you was for payroll jobs. The earnings growth data I showed you is for payroll jobs. So people who say, yeah, I work for somebody else and I'm on somebody else's payroll. And the question was, well, what about people who don't have payroll jobs, and particularly self-employed entrepreneurs and people who don't fall into that job category? It's growing. It's still a small minority of the American labor force in terms of the numbers, number of jobs we have total. So the household survey suggests there's a roughly 8 million more total jobs in the U.S. than the payroll survey picks up. So that's not quite 10% of all jobs total in the U.S., but it is, 8 million is a lot to you and me. But I'll come back to the evidence that I mentioned about tax return data. I'll also come back to a once every 3-year survey that the Federal Reserve does called the Survey of Consumer Finances, where they get a sample of people independent of whether they work for themselves or work on a payroll. Again, different data sources, and this is really important, will tell you different slices of the data. None is perfect, but the skewness of income growth in recent years shows up in all of these data sets. And I'd be happy to talk more about that in detail, but the picture that I showed you in the earlier slide on payroll job income growth is representative. Okay. So the question here is, it's not that people just need to learn about the benefits. They get all the benefits, but they're really concerned about the labor market pressures. And then a question you might want to ask is, okay, are there any cleavages in people's opinions about who's more or less likely to say they want globalization? In particular, you might think that there's industry cleavages. A lot of people will talk in the policy community about the trade-exposed industries. Well, it's automobiles, and it's textiles, apparel, and footwear, and steel. And it's only people who work in those sectors that really face the pressures of international competition directly, and therefore that we need to worry about. Or some people will say it's geography. It's Michigan, it's North Carolina, it's Georgia. It's only certain states and communities that face the pressures of globalization. Well, the nice thing is, with a lot of good data, you can kind of try to parcel out when people answer certain questions, if you know a lot about them, where they live, what industry they work in, what's their educational attainment or other measures of labor market skills, you can let the data tell you what's most important in terms of what cleavages might matter. And who knows, it might be birth month, or it might be, hair color. There's one really, really big cleavage economically that matters, and that's labor market skills. Less skilled Americans traditionally have been much more likely to say that they oppose free trade and investment than their more skilled counterparts. And importantly, I'll point out that in the public opinion data, it's not industry of employment and it's not geography. Those things explain almost nothing in terms of people's actual variation in their stated opinions. Why is that? I think the economics answer is pretty simple. It's that because we have this very dynamic US labor market, the pressures of globalization spread throughout the economy much more widely because of domestic labor market competition. So let me say that slightly differently. High school dropouts who work at Walmart are just as opposed on average to freer trade and investment as high school dropouts who work in, say, textile mills. And the reason seems to be that people who work, the high school dropouts at Walmart understand that when the pressure of international competition might shut down the textile mill up the street because of imports from China, that doesn't directly affect them at Walmart in terms of Walmart doesn't face that competition directly. But when the textile mill closes, their friends walk down the street when they've been laid off from the textile mill and apply for the same kinds of jobs as they do at Walmart. And so the pressures of international competition dissipate much more broadly throughout the US economy because we have this dynamic labor market. And the numbers are striking. I've got an example up here. Take a high school dropout with 11 years of education, put them through high school and college, and the probability that they support freer trade goes up by like 30 percentage points. So the economic impact, the kind of quantitative significance of labor market skills is really, really big traditionally in explaining people's opinions. Now, I'll emphasize that adverb traditionally, because when you look at the data for recent years, something that really worries me is that support for freer trade has waned further. And in particular, to the extent that we can tease it out of some of the surveys that we've got in recent years, a noticeable drop among high-income people. And I'll point out that vaguely coincides with the skewness of income growth in recent years, and that a big chunk, again, college graduates and non-professional master's degrees, 29% of payroll jobs in 2005, have traditionally been kind of a bedrock constituency in support of more open borders. That support seems to be eroding in recent years. The Wall Street Journal published a great poll that they did a couple of weeks ago in March. Early March, they did the survey questions. Let me give you a couple of data points from that. 4 out of 5 Americans who have less than a college degree said that they do not directly benefit from the global economy. Only 1 in 5 people with less than a high school degree, less than a college degree said that they directly benefit. 4 out of 5 said they don't. One of the things that was striking was those with a college degree or higher, only about 1 in 3 said that they directly benefit from the global economy. 2 in 3 college graduates and above said that they don't directly benefit. And another thing that I will say is the journal has run a similarly worded question about, are free trade agreements good or bad for the United States? And the change in opinion from over 7 years, from 99 to early 2007, was a swing of 27 percentage points in terms of the split between those saying it's good versus good, bad. So in late 99, it was about a 10 percentage point edge for good versus bad. And it swung to almost a 20 percentage point deficit in the March 07 survey. I'm not a political scientist, but I think, and again, the other thing I'll emphasize, I didn't say this, or if I did, let me say it again. What explains the skewness of income growth in the United States in recent years? As an academic, I will tell you we don't yet know. There's yet to be done a set of academic and policy studies to dig into the data to try to understand what economic forces, freer trade, freer investment, the rise of China and India and Central and Eastern Europe, technological change, corporate governance. What set of forces explain the rise and skewness of income growth in the US in recent years? I also don't know how long it might persist. Maybe it's going to stop tomorrow. I don't know. But I'll suggest, boy, what would the world look like, or the US look like, if the kind of income growth numbers we've seen in the past 5 to 10 years were to persist for another 5 to 10 years? I don't know, but I'll point out, remember, back in 1992, a guy named Ross Perot ran for president, and he ran on a platform that addressed a number of issues, one of which, wasn't the only one, but one of which was talking about how if we signed this thing called the North American Free Trade Agreement to allow Mexico to accede to the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, it was going to lead to a giant sucking sound, and we would lose every manufacturing job and capital good in the United States, was his prediction. Back in 1992, Ross Perot got 19.2% of the popular vote in the presidential election. And again, the story I'm telling you here is people's preferences about globalization policy line up pretty closely with how they're doing in the labor market. And I do not know what economic forces have been driving income patterns in the US in recent years. I do not know how long they will persist. I worry, hypothetically, if we go out another 5, 10 or more years with the kind of income growth we've had in the US in recent years, about what's the political economy going to be if it's 96.6% of payroll jobs are not enjoying income gains on average. That's something I worry about. Right? So I told you I was going to worry about 3 things. So sorry, there's one more. And that's the fiscal fund of being a baby buster. Right? From 1946 to 1964, that generation of Americans, added all up, there were 76 million Americans who were born in that generation. They are now, the leading cohorts in that generation are reaching traditional retirement years and exiting the labor force. And I'm a baby buster, so I was born in 1969, I come behind, and my generation, year by year, there's nowhere near as many baby busters as there are baby boomers. So that's going to impart much slower labor force growth going forward, and it's going to have an implication for the educational attainment, right? The kind of educational mix I showed you that we had in 2005, it's not going to change that dramatically between now and 2020, 2025, based on the best guesses that we have now. But the fiscal implication of all this, taxing and spending, is the following. A lot of discussion in Washington, as we all know, about taxing and spending and fiscal policy and the budget deficit and all that. It's important, I think, to put the current discussions into a broader historical context, which is if you look at the post-World War II period in the US going back 40, 50, 60 years, we've had a pretty consistent outcome of fiscal policy in the United States. And there have been legitimate and real policy disagreements. We've had recessions, booms, taxes go up and down, spending go up and down, but those are kind of squiggles around a pretty stable outcome, which looks like the following. Revenues have averaged about 18% of GDP over the past, this average I think was for the past 40 years. Some shift in the composition of where we get our taxes from. Payroll taxes have become a lot more important. Corporate taxes and excise taxes, things like border taxes, have become a lot less important in terms of the total tax revenue. And on the spending side, spending as a share of GDP, and these are at the federal level. This is federal, not including state and local taxes and spending. Federal spending has averaged about 20% of GDP, a little more. Again, a compositional change. The share of defense spending has gone down a lot, and the share of what is commonly called entitlement spending, spending on Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, that's gone up a lot. Today, that's about 8% of GDP total, a big chunk of our spending. And again, the point I want to emphasize here is we as a country have decided that's about the size of the federal government we want. And what goes into this is economics, politics, philosophy, ethics, a whole set of constellation of kind of broad issues that has led the United States to be a country that's kind of what we seem to want as a country in terms of how big our federal government is. Different countries make different choices. A lot of other OECD countries, for example, have a much bigger federal government in terms of the tax take and spending. Okay? The message that I want to convey about being a baby buster is that that equilibrium, that kind of outcome in terms of fiscal policy that we've had for decades in the United States is completely unsustainable, and it's going to change. I don't know how it's going to change, but let me tell you why it's going to change. It's because of the demographics that I mentioned of the baby boomers retiring and the baby boomers being smaller cohorts and being a smaller generation, combined with increases in healthcare spending. Ben Bernanke gave a speech about a month ago. Ben, again, is now chairman of the Federal Reserve, and he called where we are now fiscally the calm before the storm. And similarly provocative and worrisome metaphors have been used by many other business and policy leaders, trying to get people to focus on what's going to happen fiscally in the United States between now and 2030, 2040. The numbers look something like this. The big issue is that entitlement spending is projected to grow about double as a share of GDP, from about 8% today to about 16% by the time we get into 2045, 40 years from now, a little less now. And why is that happening? Well, a lot of discussion recently is about Social Security. Part of what's going on is Social Security, the amount we pay out every year is depends on how many people are in retirement eligible for Social Security, and that money comes from the people who are currently working. And given that the labor force is going to be growing a lot more slowly because of the baby boom, baby buster thing, and because retirees are enjoying such increases in how long they live, which is great, that implies a fiscal crunch for Social Security. How do you quantify that? One way that policymakers try to do it is express the present value shortfall, given the laws on the books for how much we're going to spend on Social Security going out into the future, and given the laws on the books for how much tax revenue we think we're going to take in, the difference, discounted to today, all these future payouts and revenues coming in, is about $11 trillion. That's a lot of money to you or me, right? But what I want to emphasize is the present value shortfall in Medicare and Medicaid are guesstimated to be something like $50 trillion. And what's shocking about that is both Medicare and Medicaid compared to Social Security, they're all subject to the same demographics of an aging population and slower growing labor force. But what's much more difficult about Medicare and Medicaid is the fact that healthcare spending, the cost of providing healthcare, wildly different from IT hardware like we were talking about earlier. Healthcare costs have been increasing at a rate of about double the overall rate of price inflation for years and years, decades at this point. And the best guess of experts who look at that is they don't see any reason that very rapid growth in healthcare spending is going to stop. Families see that today in terms of increases in their premiums. Companies see it in terms of the benefits costs, in terms of total compensation. Our society as a whole is going to see it because the present value shortfall in Medicare and Medicaid is estimated to be in the neighborhood of like $50 trillion. Independent of politics and in terms of the economics, fixing Social Security is not all that hard. You raise the retirement age eligibility by a few years. Maybe you make the benefits progressive to some degree so higher income people don't get the same amount that lower income people do. Some basic changes in some of the parameters of Social Security. It's not that hard to fix the present value shortfall in Social Security. It's much harder to think about how to fix the present value shortfall in Medicare and Medicaid. So another way to express this is today in 2005, spending outside of entitlements and interest on the debt in the US is 9% of GDP. So our government, 9% of GDP out of that total of spending in GDP goes to stuff other than not defaulting on our debt and entitlement spending. And the projected growth in entitlement spending is almost double that, right? So what that means is a really stark set of choices our country faces. If the spending projections go as we think, and we don't change taxes at all, instead of being in this stable outcome we've had for decades and decades of taxes at about 18% of GDP and spending at about 20% of GDP, we'll have taxes at 18% of GDP and spending at about 28% of GDP. That's a year-on-year deficit that we're projecting out once we get to about 2040 of about 10% of GDP, fiscal deficit every year that would need to be funded. And if you know anything about kind of the history of public finance around the world, those are really, really big deficits. It is unlikely that world investors and bond markets will allow the US to continue to borrow 10% of GDP at today's current interest rates. So what are we as a country going to do? I don't know. Again, this is not an issue of economics. It's largely an issue of kind of politics and philosophy. But the choices are pretty clear. If the gap that we're going to be looking at is 18% of GDP for taxes, 28% of GDP for spending, well, there's a few ways to close that. We could have really big tax increases and go to 28 and 28 roughly. If we as a society decide we don't want to have tax revenues go beyond 18% of GDP, we're going to have some really big spending cuts. We're either going to have to radically scale back the amount of entitlement spending that we have going forward, change the laws on the books for Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, or an alternative, just so we're clear about the magnitudes, we could meet the projected increase in entitlement spending, but then in 2045, roughly, our federal government will do just two things so that we can keep our government at 20% of GDP. We'll make payments on Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, and we'll pay interest on the debt. That's it. So this phrase here of near elimination of all non-entitlement, non-interest spending, I mean literally. I don't mean like slowing the rate of growth of spending for the National Science Foundation and our parks. I mean eliminating it, cutting it to zero. Defense also put in there, right? So how's our country going to settle this? I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. But one of the issues that is starting to face our country is how are we going to face this fiscal, as Ben Bernanke called it, the calm before the storm. And every year that goes by where there is not a set of economic policies changed, again, given the wonderful magic of compound interest, the changes that will have to come in the future are just going to have to be more dramatic. All right? So let me close. And I'm sorry, like I said at the outset, I don't mean this to be dour, but this context is important. The U.S. economy, the productivity growth we've enjoyed in recent times is wonderful. And it's because of the innovation and efforts of American companies, American workers, the American governments, kind of all the different stakeholders in the American economy. The fact that we've been able to deliver this acceleration in productivity growth is great. And economic openness to trade investment has been really, really important for helping deliver this productivity acceleration. But, I gave us three things to think about, which is, the pushback and the policy drift away from more open borders, what's happening in income distribution, what's happening on the fiscal side, and these things are not unrelated. And these are a set of important policy challenges that, again, I don't have a crystal ball, but that are really going to require thoughtful discussion and engagement of all people, businesses, workers, government, citizens, to hopefully address some of these challenges. And again, they're the kind of challenges that, from what I've learned about Alice, were the kinds of things that she thought about, right? And so I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you about this today, and I'm happy to continue the discussion with questions if you want to talk further. Thank you. Please.
One comment. The previous slide with major cuts or major increases in taxes and cuts sort of sounded like Michigan right now. That's what we're looking at. I don't know if you're aware of our budget situation, but that's what we're looking at. And then second, the question is, are there any other governments that have kind of gone through this sort of a process, or are we just so unique that there really aren't any benchmarks or lessons to be learned from other situations around the world?
Let me comment on each of those in turn. You're right. Michigan, is, you all know better than I, right? I mean, many states are in the same boat, and Michigan has been in recent years. And one of the things I'll just gently point out, CEA for quite some time, and when I was at CEA, part of what we try to get people to understand when we talk about the fiscal challenges is there's no magic wand. And in particular, given where most countries are with their actual tax rates today, there's no magic bullet of cut taxes and they pay for themselves. Right? You want to get an increase in tax revenue, you need to increase tax rates, or you need to expand the tax base. Pretty straightforward. So whether it's at the state level in Michigan, at the national level for our country, if we choose as a country to have the levels of spending, and I'm not saying we shouldn't, you know what? The tax revenue needs to be found. And the other thing I'll say is, yes, we, the United States, are not alone. In fact, if you look at international data, as worried as, hopefully I didn't make you too worried about where we are in the United States, because many other countries look much, much worse in terms of the fiscal challenges that face their countries, because their underlying demographics are even worse than they are in the United States. One prominent example of that is Japan. The prime working age labor force in Japan has been shrinking for about 5 to 10 years now already at a rate of nearly 1% per year. The population, total population in Japan in 2006 started shrinking. So countries like Japan, Italy, France, there's a lot of other high-income countries like the United States where the underlying demographics are shockingly worse than they are here. And what drives that is a set of complicated socioeconomic factors. Very low fertility rates in a lot of these countries, much lower than in the US. Part of what helps the United States also is we have, part of how we support population growth is through immigration inflows. Right? So again, these things are related. The political economy of immigration has a lot to do with how some of our fiscal challenges do or don't get solved. And in 2004, all of 2004, you know how many people immigrated to Japan? 2,400. All of 2004 was the total amount of immigration into Japan. So that's part of the reason some other countries have fiscal challenges that will be much worse than we have. So we're going to learn a bit, you know, kind of sort of know after you sort of thing with a lot of other governments around the world. Please.
I would contend that the problem may even be a little more dire, because if we take your last line there, and we choose one of those three or some combination of those three, I suspect we would still have a major issue, because companies are still going to be facing the benefits necessary for those medical benefits to go with that, because they're facing those same projections. And as a result, I think you're missing the solution, which is healthcare. I mean, something's going to have to happen, and it's certainly not just, you know, let's nationalize it, it's done. It's much more complicated than that.
Yeah.
But that's sort of a root problem here.
Absolutely. So I don't disagree with that. So it's an issue of kind of, especially for the provision of healthcare, both through the federal government and by individuals and corporations. I'm not an expert in healthcare by any means, but it is an astonishingly complicated industry where, different from a lot of other businesses, the incentives and the lack of clear incentives and lack of clear information clearly is a problem. I do not profess to know well how to fix that, but there's an issue of would things be improved if we have one single national purchaser of healthcare? Would things be improved if we reduce some of the asymmetries in our tax code to lead people to make certain choices? Would things be improved if we somehow decoupled the linking of healthcare provision with people's jobs? I mean, historically, that's an anachronism and it's an outgrowth of World War II, when wage and price controls that were put in place prevented companies from giving people pay raises in terms of the actual dollars they paid. And so companies, a huge chunk of companies shifted to trying to attract people. Remember, labor is very scarce during World War II because a lot of people were off fighting in the military all over the world. Companies tried to attract workers by starting to offer and expand healthcare to them. So
there may not be a free lunch, but isn't there a quasi-free lunch?
I wish.
If productivity growth continues at the rate of the past 10 years, then by the time you're out at 2045, incomes will have more than doubled in real terms, and whether it's a 10% increase in tax rates or a 5% increase in tax rates and a 5% reduction in spending rates on entitlements, it will not necessarily seem as dire, because you're talking about still pretty major gains for everybody, and some of the gains go to pay for things that we value.
Absolutely. So two things. One is, yes, I absolutely agree that for these policy challenges, the fiscal ones we face in particular, faster productivity growth is really important. To faster productivity growth, in some sense, making the economic pie bigger, will ameliorate the severity of the choices we're going to face. That's definitely right. That said, my second comment is, but it's subtle and complicated, meaning things like, again, think about what's going to happen on the income side in terms of the distribution of the productivity gains. One of the things that's happened, for example, with Social Security, remember the payroll tax that is the primary source, if you buy these accounting conventions, for the money that goes into Social Security, the payroll tax is capped. I think currently the law is it's capped at earnings of $94,000. So one of the things that the actuarial numbers that kind of govern Social Security that's been surprising relative to projections that were done in, say, the early 1980s when Alan Greenspan and some others, there was a Social Security Commission, I think 83, that made some changes back then. One of the ways that commission was really off was they overpredicted growth in Social Security revenues coming in through the payroll tax because they didn't foresee the extent of the rise in income inequality and the extent to which a lot of the income gains were going to be at the high end of the income distribution and therefore above the FICA cap. So I totally agree that productivity growth is going to help. But then again, also the other thing I'll point out is kind of how people, what the laws on the books are for payouts, whether it's indexed to the CPI or to average earnings growth. Those types of what seem like weedy, who cares decisions really, really matter when we've got these differential movements in relative prices. And so those, and the example I gave of FICA is an important one. And that's why, again, I worry some of the slowdown in productivity growth in recent years in the US that I mentioned, some of it may be cyclical, but there is, I think, if you look at the world experts that look at these things in the research, in the academic and policy communities, there's increasing concern that some of it may be structural. And all these issues are going to be harder if we go back to the 1973 to 1995 generation of much slower productivity growth.
You mentioned early in your conversation this afternoon about the Wall Street Journal article yesterday afternoon, and it was very eye-opening that if you look at the number of jobs and the types of jobs that are potentially exportable to other countries because of the ability to get them at lower wages, and what effect that will have on this growing, attitude towards protectionism. There is no clear answer, but I think that that's very telling. Accounting, it was amazing to me the number of different jobs that potentially could be exported at a lower cost, which only exacerbates the problem of a lower quality of life.
Absolutely. So I agree. And the article that was alluded to in the Wall Street Journal yesterday was an article that talked about a lot of the recent interesting work by Alan Blinder, who's an economist at Princeton. And Alan was at CEA at some point in the Clinton administration. He was on the Federal Reserve Board. And Alan's done this very interesting work trying to get a handle on, well, what economic activities are now tradable across borders. And with the advances, especially with the internet and communications technology, now a lot of information can cross borders, and a lot of kind of activities and occupations that related to the flow of information can now be transacted across borders in a way that they couldn't literally 5 or 10 years ago. So that's one way. The flow of people across borders has always been really important, but now IT is a substitute for the people of flowing across border as a complement. But one of the things I'll say there is, I will acknowledge in many settings like this over the years, I get confronted with the question of, globalization is great. What do you know about globalization? You sit in your ivory tower with tenure and all. What do you know about the pressures of globalization? And my rejoinder to that is always, I've faced it quite directly over the years through immigration. So for me, the main dimension of globalization that's been a pressure has been immigration inflows. When I look at my entering class at MIT, there were 30 of us, 15 were foreign nationals, and 15 were US citizens. And I'm sure if we went through the faculty here at Oakland University or mine at the Tuck School at Dartmouth, and you go read through the faculty list, and you think about what sizable chunk of academics in the United States are foreign-born, that's how I face the pressures of globalization. If suddenly I wave a magic wand tomorrow and ask all non-US citizen academics to leave our country, is that going to benefit American higher education and benefit the country as a whole? No way. Am I going to be better off? Yeah. And what the Alan Blinder thing speaks to is trying to get a handle on how globalization kind of used to mean for a lot of people putting stuff on boats, trading goods across borders, automobiles, machine tools, tractors. That's still part of it, but the dimensions of globalization now seem much broader. And the anecdote I'll give to come back to kind of the digitization of information, what that means is there's a company, and when I've taught this stuff to some of the MBAs over the years, there's a Tuck alum who started a corporation that does the following. It's involved in doing due diligence on commercial real estate transactions. Think of a big office building in Detroit, suppose the Renaissance Center, that was called, goes up for sale. You're a prospective buyer of that, there might be 500 leases in the Renaissance Center. And if you want to crunch the numbers, how do you do that to try to price the value of that building? Traditionally, what got done in investment banking and transactions was folks would sample. They'd only have the time and energy to take maybe 10% of the leases. and look at them and crunch the numbers and have all the MBAs crunch all the numbers and do all the finance stuff and say, okay, the value of these leases is this, and I'm going to guess that they're representative, so the total value of the building is that. This gentleman I know, an associate who was a Tuck alum, used to do that, and then with advances in IT and stuff, said to himself, you know what? I can go into what they call these war rooms. I can go into one of these war rooms, and instead of taking one of every 10 leases, I'm going to take every one of them. And I'm going to take, and literally it says filing cabinets full of files. It's like when I go to my dentist, right? I don't know what your dentist office is like, but it's all paper files of the dental records. Think about healthcare. It's just a footnote, but. And then what did he, this Tuck alum, he started this business where they digitize every piece of paper, make them into PDF files, and they've hired hundreds and hundreds of MBAs in India. And they crunch the numbers on every single lease. And instead of doing some imperfect sampling of the Renaissance Center, they can go through every single lease and to the dollar tell you the value of everything. And then every time he's come to visit my class, it gets as quiet as, I don't know what, church on a Sunday morning. And then finally somebody gets the courage to ask the $64,000 question, can you tell me what you pay your MBAs in India? And because I was on leave, I haven't done this in a couple of years now. But I guess it would have been spring of 05, so gross it up with inflation, whatever you want. High earnings in India have been growing at 10, 15% per year, but the number's still going to shock you. He'd say, oh, all in, $5,000 a year. There was a question way in the back.
Okay, so given the pattern that you showed in income growth inequality from 2000 to 2005, should I feel guilty about having spent the last 5 years discouraging my students from going to law school?
Wow. What's the line from Shakespeare?
Only if they were going to go to Wall Street and work for investment bank.
Yeah. Well, and that speaks to, that's a good anecdote. There was this wonderful story in the Journal a few months ago talking about doctors, looking at kind of this rise in inequality, and it was a study that looked at a set of doctors. And I can't remember if they were from I'm not going to get it right, I'm sorry, so I'm not going to get the historical record right, but they looked at a handful of doctors, MDs. And there was one that they focused on, so instead of, I don't know, it was like 5. 4 of them were doctors, they were practicing docs, they maybe worked at a hospital, or they went out in their own practice, and they're doing very well, right? They're making 6 figures, and they're doing okay. They're not zillionaires. And one of them was a doc, and I can't remember what practice he had, and then through a mutual friend or some connection, kith or kin, went to work in Wall Street as an analyst, looking at healthcare companies. And this gentleman now makes an order of magnitude more each year, and so one of the things, and I'm not saying this is good or bad, but the point is one of the dimensions of inequality that we're seeing is even within the educational cohorts, you're seeing this real dispersion of income performance. So why is that? Again, I will tell you as an egghead academic, it's a fascinating question that there's still hundreds of papers that will be written in the coming years trying to understand what's going on. But to the question of keep in mind, this is changes. Keep in mind, levels really matter too. It is still the case that on average, having a college degree, the lifetime payoff to a college degree as opposed to a high school degree is huge, right? And of course, more importantly than economics, there's a whole host of political and philosophical and ethical benefits to our country from having an educated citizenry, right?
2 more questions.
So, please.
Yeah, Alan Blinder was on the Diane Reed show this morning discussing much of what you're discussing.
Yeah.
And he got into the issue of what sort of public policy this sort of suggests. And he observed that we seem to be going in exactly the wrong way in one respect, in that, countering this sort of suggests much more emphasis on the development of human resources and what David Friday calls, promoting the creative class, leading to greater gains in research, development, technology, and so on. And that this seems to be de-emphasized in recent years. What's your comment with regard to that observation?
I'd say 2 things. One is that's the $64 zillion question. Is kind of what again, I don't know what's causing this. I do not know how long it's going to persist. But to the extent that you want to think about all states of the world, business people do this, and policymakers should do this, and we should all do this as citizens. What if this were to persist? Kind of what's the public policy solution? Don't tell them don't go to law school. Don't tell them drop out of college. Again, levels matter in addition to changes. But the one thing I'm always struck by is the political economy discussion about globalization has, for decades, I will assert, in the U.S. been gainers are pretty broad and wide, and it's a pretty focused set of people that don't directly benefit. And importantly, the way in which they don't benefit is in transition. We just got to help people get from that one job to the next when the layoffs happen. I worry that transitions matter, and I don't mean to belittle them. They're very important, but that is not sufficient. Median duration of unemployment in the United States today is only about 8 weeks. And I'm not saying that's not a difficult 8 weeks, and any separation is very difficult, but for the U.S. economy overall, we've got a very flexible labor market. It's not about the numbers of jobs, it's about the kinds of jobs in terms of earnings. And in terms of the magnitudes, to the extent that TAA, Trade Adjustment Assistance, has been the main since 1962 when the Kennedy administration implemented this as part of generating domestic political support for the Kennedy round of trade negotiations in the GATT. There's been a presumption that that's the main mechanism for facilitating the compensation issues for globalization and freer trade. And by construction, TAA is set up along industry lines, and today, at least as the law is in the books, it's only manufacturing industries, certain manufacturing industries. So, the MBAs in commercial real estate and then the other examples that Alan Blind has been working on, those things by definition aren't covered by the law. And just for the record, TAA last year, we spent about $300 million at the federal level on TAA. That's about 1/100th of 1% of all federal spending.
Last question.
Please.
Matthew, getting back to the question that was asked before about the state economy, another $64,000 question. What advice would you give our governor in terms of things that we need to do in the state of Michigan to turn around our economy?
Wow, where's the time gone? No, that's a great question. That's another gazillion-dollar question. It's hard. I mean, right, the state of Michigan faces this real challenge that a lot of other states don't, which is you have the legacy of the big three automakers, right? And I acknowledge that. They're great companies. They've been great companies. They will continue to be great companies, but they are exhibit A of the pressures of international trade and investment in the automobile industry have generated big gains for America overall. Not every American community, state, set of industries and workers has benefited. And I don't deny that. That's a real challenge. So I think a lot of policymakers within the U.S. at the local level and countries overall, they try to think about one of the things I'll say, people oftentimes say to me, well, what's the set of industries we should be in? And my rejoinder to that is, I got to tell you, I have no idea. And the anecdote I'll give, which I think is important, is it's in the public domain that in early 1995, Bill Gates and a lot of the executives at Microsoft took a look at this thing called Netscape and this emerging thing called the internet, and they spent all this time and energy. They said, you know what? We don't really need to change our business model. This internet thing, it might be a bunch of geek scientists swapping data files back and forth, but it's not really going to be anything that's going to affect our material business model. So, I take comfort in the fact that when Bill Gates and his colleagues at Microsoft didn't foresee the growth in the internet in some fundamental business way, I don't quite know what are going to be the right industries going forward. But then what all states and I think countries aspire to is kind of having the right infrastructure, meaning the right set of skills and people and talents and kind of tax code, those types of things that will allow the good globally engaged companies to choose to set up and expand operations where they are. Because one of the things I'm struck by today is the ability of the Chryslers and everybody else to think about where they want to operate around the world. It is really different from what it was even 10 years ago. Right, 10 years ago, China and India and Central Eastern Europe, in some basic sense, were still economically on the moon. And they're really, really not today. And it might change. Goodness knows what might happen politically around the world. But barring some sad outcomes, they're now part of the global economy to stay. And so the question is, for communities like Michigan, how can you educate kids and keep them there and have a tax code and have a set of amenities that are going to keep those companies there? And I know that's kind of a big picture answer, and we could go into details, but I'm convinced it's not trying to say we know that industry X is going to be the winner. Lots of countries and communities have tried that, and it almost always fails.
We're going to move across the corridor so you can ask a question to Dr. Slaughter, where we have coffee and cookies and punch across the corridor. We'll take a minute before we leave. I want to present to Dr. Slaughter the Alice Connor Gorlin Memorial Award.
Great.
Here, here.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Well, thanks to him for coming, and thanks to you for coming, and we look forward to doing this again next year. Again, join us across the corridor behind the glass doors for coffee, cookies, and punch. Thank you.